This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a philosopher of science at Gettysburg College in the United States. He is also the author of a new book entitled Einstein, His Space and Time, that was recently published by Yale University Press and is dedicated to the most famous Jewish scientist in history and to the impact he has left on our world. Professor Stephen Gimbel is joining me now on the line from Pennsylvania. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
So what is it about Einstein that makes him really stand apart from other great scientists of human history?
Einstein is a singular figure. He's such a fascinating character. I think part of it is certainly the genius, that here is a man who completely reshaped our understanding of the nature of space, time, motion. But he also was a larger figure. He was an historical figure. He was somebody who played a role in the politics of his time, who stood out as a social commentator, and who comes to us in a curious fashion representing what I think a real picture of modernism. Einstein was a rebel. He was a nonconformist. He appeals to all of us because we all want to be different. And here is somebody that we celebrate in essence because he really had the courage to stand up and just be strange.
Do you think that we all strive to be different? To my mind, we all strive to be alike.
Well, I think it's certainly the case that there is a deep sense of insecurity in human beings, and when you look at social psychology, we do go along with the crowd. And yet, if you ask all of us, because our own lived experiences are so personal, we do, I think, see ourselves as different, as unique. And what Einstein, I think, represents, I give talks about Einstein all over the world, and I always ask, very simple question. When you think of Einstein, what's the first thing that comes to mind? And sheepishly, almost across the board, everyone says the hair.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here is just this fascinating, complex figure. Why is it that the one thing we all think about is that hair?
Yeah.
And I think the purpose is, when you look at someone, the first thing you see, face and hair. Hair is largely a political statement. And when Einstein allowed his hair to be what it was, he was saying, I am not going to take these social conventions seriously. I am going to be unafraid to be me. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that is attractive to us.
So how come he was looked up to and not looked down onto as an eccentric old man?
Well, I think there certainly were those who did look down on him, and he had, a significant number of enemies throughout his life. But I think the reason why he's generally admired is that he comes along at a time of great social change, and what he does is really represent a sort of changing of the intellectual guard. At the time when Einstein's writing, you see simultaneous revolutions, not only in physics and in mathematics, but in art, in architecture, in music, in the social sciences. You start to see ideas being seriously considered that undermine the foundations of all the studies from which they come. And so here you have Einstein, who's representing this new way of seeing the world. Mm-hmm. And that new way is one in which the old sort of strictures, which kept us, constrained within certain ways of thinking, certain ways of being, were being challenged. And Einstein, both as a scientist and as a social figure, as an icon, I think represents that sense of intellectual freedom that we all aspire to.
Which came first, really, if you look at his biography? Was he a great scientist first or a political commentator first?
He was a great scientist first, although he always had a political bone in his body. Even from the time when he was very young, he grew up in an adolescent Germany where there were still military parades that would happen regularly, and he found in him a deep disdain for not only all things military, but anything that had to do with a sense of authority. And so Einstein, who, from age 9, he really becomes fascinated with the world of science, ultimately becomes, the great thinker that we all know. But it was in using the fame that came with the science that he was able to make himself into a political figure. So he always had pacifistic leanings. He always had internationalist leanings. But it was the fame that came with the science that gave him a platform from which to become a political figure. And he didn't shy away from it. And in fact, it led to enemies and death threats.
Exactly. Even though pacifism wasn't exactly the most fashionable trend in the early 20th century, especially in Germany.
Especially in Germany. He left Germany as a young man, renounced his citizenship, ultimately gets lured back by Max Planck, who gave him just a plum job and a significant raise at a time when he needed it personally. But this was just before World War I, and World War I in Germany was nearly universally lauded by all parts of the political spectrum. It was, in a time of war, and this was supposed to be the war that was going to establish Germany's preeminence in the world. This was going to be really the event that led to German power across the globe, certainly across Europe at least. And so when Einstein stands up against it, it's seen as traitorous. And when the war ends up not going so well, not to give away the ending to anyone who hasn't seen the movie, Germany is left in this strange place where you have a real split in the community between the conservatives and the internationalists. And here's Einstein, right, who is this symbol of internationalism. And the German nationalists at the time, they denied that Germany even lost the war, right? How do you lose a war when someone else invades and takes over your country? No one had invaded the fatherland, so Germany didn't lose the war. But if we did, then it was because of those communists, socialists, and liberals. And Einstein really was seen as the figure of those people.
Exactly. So how instrumental was he really in playing into the hands of the German nationalists that tried really to dump all the ills of that period on the Jews? And Einstein, being a Jew, an intellectual, a cosmopolitan, every single bad word that you could possibly come up with.
Indeed. He made it easy for them in the sense that they didn't like him, he didn't like them, and he was very overtly political. So he was writing letters in, prominent papers in Berlin at the time. He was traveling to the United States, to Britain, and worst of all, to France, where he was warmly greeted by the people the conservatives saw as the enemy. And here he was being considered the rehabilitated German, the new German. And it just rankled them. And what he would do in those talks is engage in what we now call dog whistle politics. He would use phrases that had little meaning to his audiences abroad, but when the people back home heard the comments, it was very clear what he was doing. And so it seemed as if he was airing dirty laundry in places where he oughtn't. And so he became a despised man politically.
Mm-hmm. To what extent do you think that his Jewishness played a part in all this? What was he? Did he see himself as a Jew, a full-fledged Jew?
Well, Einstein was a believing, practicing, observant Jew when he was 9 years old. And then towards the end of that year, just as he turned 10, his mindset changed. He, for many years, well into his adulthood, denied any sense of Jewish identity. At one point, he was offered his first real academic position in The Hague, and the paperwork required him to fill out, just a standard visa form where there was a line that said religion, and he wrote dissenter. And it almost cost him the position. The bureaucrat, said, no, you need to put down that you're Jewish. He said,
bureaucrats don't have a sense of humor.
Exactly. And so well into his adulthood, he denied a sense of Jewish identity, but then really there were two things that really affected him and caused him in his later adult years to strongly identify himself as a Jew, that he would give talks to Jewish organizations, he would raise money for Zionist causes, and he would always use the pronouns we and us. So at some point he turns and really does consider himself Jewish. Now, the political enemies he made branded his science Jewish science, and he began to receive death threats. Mm-hmm. And so he started to think about this question of whether he is in fact Jewish. And there were two elements that really sort of turned his mind. One was the flood of immigrants that were coming in from Eastern Europe, who were fleeing the pogroms, coming from Russia, coming from the Ukraine, and the horrible stories they were bringing. He was in touch with a number of these young people who were students at the time, clearly very bright, capable students, but not people of means. And so he was moved by their plight, and he saw them as, in his words, his kinsmen. Mm-hmm. And then at the same time, he realizes that he's got a broad range of friends, but that there are fundamentally different relationships he has with his Jewish friends compared to his non-Jewish friends. Even those who had converted, there was just something about the culture from which he came that fundamentally altered how he would relate to these people. And he realized that there was something in him, that he was being defined as Jewish by the anti-Semites, and that he had a choice. He could either let them define what it meant for him to be a Jew, or he could define. And so he undertook a bit of a project to understand what it means for one, in particular him, to be Jewish despite being completely secular. Mm-hmm. So at this point he's having dinner with, say, Martin Buber. They were good friends. And
the famous Jewish philosopher, yeah.
Exactly.
And theologian, yeah.
And they would sit at the table and they would have these wonderful conversations, and the question crossed Einstein's mind, what is it that makes us both Jewish? We believe very different things. We live very different lives, and yet there is something that makes us both Jewish. And so this, towards the end of his life, became one of those questions Einstein began to investigate.
Mm-hmm. But what about his work specifically? You said earlier that there wasn't quite a clear separation between his scientific work and his political activity and public persona. If you look, for example, at his most famous work, The Theory of Relativity, and you try to analyze it, and perhaps, I wouldn't know how to call it philosophically or what, are there any Jewish elements or elements that you could call Jewish in The Theory of Relativity?
Well, my last book looked at exactly this question. So before the biography, I wrote a book called Einstein's Jewish Science, Physics at the Intersection of Politics and Religion, where I wanted to look at this claim that the Nazis made, that relativity theory was Jewish science, and ask, is there any way we can interpret that phrase that might make it true? Now, let me be clear, there is nothing in his scientific thought that is in any way influenced by Torah or Talmud. But what is interesting is that in almost all of Einstein's works, there is one fundamental move he makes. Now, it often strikes people odd to think that scientists have styles of work. We think of science as something so objective and cut and dry. It doesn't strike us strange that an artist might have a style, that you could look at a painting you've never seen and recognize it as a Picasso, or a piece of music you've never heard and say, that's Brahms. But in the case of science, it's also the case. When you look at how scientists think, there are often fingerprints they leave. And for Einstein, his fundamental move is to take a phenomenon, take something you can observe, say, look, there are two ways we could think of this, which are seemingly incongruous. And yet what he's going to do is find some larger reference frame in which to say the absolute underlying truth takes both of these contrasting views and brings them together into a single coherent view. So he's going to take multiple perspectives and say that by taking these different viewpoints, what we actually get is a deeper insight into the nature of the underlying world, which we don't have direct access to. So in a certain sense, the way he thinks is structurally not that dissimilar to Talmud. Now, the claim here is not one of cause and effect. The claim here is not that, his Jewishness influenced the way he thinks. Maybe it did, maybe he didn't. We can't get into the mind.
Yeah, what do you think? What is your opinion?
I think it certainly is interesting that the correlation is so strong. He grew up in a Jewish community. So certainly there is a way of thinking that you're acculturated into, but it was a Jewish community that was, very much fascinated with Enlightenment values, not necessarily traditional values. So, his family, for example, was so secular, he was sent to a Catholic school for elementary school. So it's not as if he's, someone like Emil Durkheim, who, the great sociologist, who came from a long line of rabbis and who himself, was at a yeshiva before he decided to become a scientist. So in that case, you could see something like, that way of thinking being imprinted on him and then it being applied elsewhere. That's not the case with Einstein. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it is peculiar that the relationship is so striking.
Yeah. How comfortable was he with his celebrity status?
Not at all. Einstein was, a fascinating character, but he was, like many very smart people, socially quite awkward. And he did not like the sorts of trappings of fame. He thought them shallow and meaningless. And here he was being universally admired, and he was the sort of person who looked at those who had inflated senses of themselves with disdain. So the last thing he wanted to do was to listen to his own press releases. That is, he didn't want, this fame to influence him. And so what he would do is mock it and poke fun at it, make jokes of it. And, of course, that only led to people adoring him even more.
Mm-hmm. Do you regret not having been able to have dinner with him?
Oh, absolutely. That's been actually one of the wonderful things about speaking about Einstein in the United States, especially on the East Coast, is that rarely do I talk without somebody coming up saying, I lived in Princeton in the 50s. I got to meet Einstein. And so those connections are still, in a living generation, which has been just wonderful to find.
Yeah, and he has served as a model to generations of geeks from the 50s onwards. Professor Stephen Gimbel, I'm afraid this is all we have time for. You're a philosopher of science at Gettysburg College in the United States, and your new book, Einstein, His Space and Time, has just come out. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
That brings us to the end of our show today. Thank you very much for listening. Also, big thanks to Alex Benish, the technical producer of this show. I'm Gilad Halpern, signing off here in Tel Aviv. Do join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.
אני יושב בתחנת משטרה, לא עשיתי כלום ואני לא זוכר מה היא אמרה, כן ולא זאת אותה תשובה, לא עשיתי כלום בתחנה של משטרה, אני קשור לכיסא עליי המנורה, את לא תוציא ממני הודעה, אפשר כוס מים, אני צמא נורא, היא עבודה, היא בודדה, לעתים היא מתבלבלת בין עובדה לעובדה, היא העבודה ואני העובד, מטוטלת כבד ואני לא מבין איך זה קרה, אני יושב בתחנת משטרה, לא עשיתי כלום ואני לא זוכר מה היא אמרה, כן ולא זאת אותה תשובה, לא עשיתי כלום מהון להון, תגיד עליון, אני הורדתי מחירים ללא שום היגיון ואני שרתי לשירים, איך אני שרתי עליון, שהקירות בחדר יסתדקו אם לא נכון, תראי אותי, אני אדם אמיתי, אמנם פתחתי את הדלת אבל סגרת לי אותי, את מכירת שקרים, יודעת מה אומרים, אש נדלקת רק כשמשחקים בגפרורים. אני לא מבין איך זה קרה, אני יושב בתחת